Welcome to Sherlock's Casebook, where every mystery has a story, and every story hides a secret. Step into the world of deduction, suspense, and untold cases of Sherlock Holmes. Are you ready to uncover the truth? The Phantom's Shadow. It was in the brisk autumn of 1893 when I found myself once again drawn into the enigmatic world of my dear friend Sherlock Holmes. The air in London was thick with the mingling scents of damp cobblestone and coal smoke, and the lamplights cast long flickering shadows across Baker Street. I had resolved to spend a quiet evening at 2B, enjoying the warmth of a crackling fire, when an unexpected visitor disrupted our peace. A frantic pounding at the door startled us. Mrs. Hudson, ever patient despite her grievances about Holmes's peculiar habits, opened it to reveal a dishevelled man in his middle years. His coat was crumpled, his cravat loosely knotted, and his eyes, wild with fear, darted about as though expecting some unseen pursuer. "Dr. Watson! Mr. Holmes! You must help me!" he gasped, staggering into the room. Holmes, who had been reclining with his pipe, his gaze fixed upon the ceiling, sat up with sudden interest. "Calm yourself, sir," he said, scrutinizing the man, with an intensity that made even me uneasy. "Take a breath. Tell us your name and why you believe yourself in such mortal peril." The man swallowed hard. "I am Harold Ainsworth, solicitor to Lord Blackwood of Mayfair. But that is not why I am here. It is Whitechapel, Mr. Holmes. The spectre. It has returned." I exchanged a glance with Holmes, who arched an eyebrow. "A spectre, you say?" His tone was both amused and intrigued. Ainsworth nodded feverishly. "The Phantom of Whitechapel. They said it was an old wives' tale, nothing but superstition. But now," he shuddered, "it's real. A man is dead, and I fear I am next." Holmes steepled his fingers and studied Ainsworth with an inscrutable expression. "Curious," he murmured. "Tell me, Mr. Ainsworth, what precisely have you seen?" The solicitor hesitated, as though the very recollection was painful. "Last night I was returning from a meeting with a client. I took a hansom cab through Whitechapel, past the old tenements where the Ripper once stalked. As I passed an alley, I saw it, a shadow against the fog. Tall, inhumanly thin, moving with an unnatural swiftness. And then," he faltered, "then I saw the body." I leaned forward. "A victim." Ainsworth swallowed again. "Yes, a man, Thomas Gillis, a journalist. He had been following the legend of the Phantom for weeks, convinced that it was more than a mere ghost story. But now he is dead, his throat cut as cleanly as if by a surgeon's blade. And near the body, I swear upon my life, I saw the shadow move again." A tense silence followed. I could see the flicker of excitement in Holmes's sharp, grey eyes. A case of logic masked beneath, superstition, precisely the sort to capture his interest. Holmes finally stood, brushing non-existent dust from his coat. "Mr. Ainsworth," he said, reaching for his hat and cane, "you have piqued my curiosity. Come, Watson. It appears we have a date with a ghost." The scene of the crime. The hansom cab rattled through the damp streets of London, the distant chime of church bells marking the hour. As we approached Whitechapel, the air grew heavier, thick with the scent of rain-soaked stone and something more unpleasant. A faint metallic tang that spoke of old blood and forgotten sins. Harold Ainsworth sat opposite us, his fingers drumming anxiously against his knee. Holmes, ever composed, remained deep in thought, his sharp eyes flickering with calculations known only to himself. "Tell me, Mr. Ainsworth," he said suddenly, breaking the silence. This journalist, Thomas Gillis, what precisely was he investigating? I do not subscribe to ghosts, nor do I believe you do either. So what is it that Gillis discovered that cost him his life? Ainsworth hesitated. I do not know the full extent of it. But Gillis was convinced that the Phantom was no mere legend. He claimed there was a pattern, murders that had gone unnoticed, dismissed as random violence. He believed someone was orchestrating them, hiding behind the myth of the Phantom to cover their crimes. Holmes nodded. An invisible hand, behind the curtain, using superstition as a smokescreen. A clever ruse, if true. And what of Lord Blackwood? You mentioned he was your client. Does he have any connection to this affair? Ainsworth's face tightened. Not directly, but he is a powerful man, with many enemies, and... He hesitated again. Gillis had requested a meeting with him. Something about an article he was working on, but the meeting never took place. "Interesting," murmured Holmes, a journalist uncovering a dangerous truth, a nobleman with hidden ties, and a solicitor who fears for his life. Watson, we have all the makings of a most engaging puzzle. The cab came to a halt, and the driver rapped twice on the roof. "Here we are, gents," he called. Holmes descended first, his keen eyes sweeping the scene before him. Whitechapel at night was a place of shadows and whispered secrets. The gas lamps flickered feebly against the encroaching fog, their glow failing to reach the depths of the narrow alleyways. The few figures that skulked about disappeared at the sight of us, vanishing like phantoms themselves. "Lead us to the body," Holmes instructed. Ainsworth hesitated before nodding, guiding us through a winding path between crumbling brick buildings. Soon we arrived at a narrow alley, blocked by a single constable who stood stiffly at his post. Upon seeing Holmes, he started slightly. "Mr. Holmes, I suppose it was only a matter of time before you turned up," he stammered. Holmes offered a thin smile. "Inspector Lestrade has taught his men well. But tell me, have you moved anything?" The constable shook his head. "No, sir. Inspector's orders. The body's just as we found it." "Excellent. Watson, let us proceed." With that, we stepped into the alley, where Thomas Gillis lay in a pool of darkened blood. His body was sprawled against the damp cobblestone, his limbs unnaturally twisted. His throat bore a single, precise slash. Clean, efficient, not the work of a common ruffian. Holmes crouched beside the corpse, his expression unreadable. He reached into his coat and produced a magnifying glass, moving with meticulous precision as he examined every detail. "Curious," he muttered. "What is?" I asked, stepping closer. Holmes pointed to the victim's hands. No defensive wounds, no struggle. He never saw his killer coming. Ainsworth exhaled shakily. Then it was the Phantom? Holmes ignored him, shifting his attention to the ground. He traced a gloved finger over a faint mark near the victim's boot. "Watson, observe. This smear. What do you make of it?" I leaned in, noting the faint streak against the cobblestone. "It appears to be soot." Holmes nodded. Precisely. But there are no open chimneys here, no sign of coal merchants. So how did soot find its way here? Ainsworth frowned. You think it means something? Holmes stood, dusting off his coat. Everything means something, Mr. Ainsworth. The question is whether it speaks the truth or seeks to deceive us. A sudden noise echoed from deeper in the alley. A soft rustling, barely audible. Holmes stiffened, his gaze snapping towards the darkness beyond. Watson, he murmured, we are being watched. The watcher in the dark. For a moment, all was still. The only sound was the distant hum of London's night, hooves clattering over damp cobblestones, the occasional shout of a late-night reveller. And yet Holmes had sensed something or someone lurking just beyond our sight. My hand instinctively drifted to my cane, though I knew it would be of little use against a hidden assailant. Holmes, however, did not move. He merely tilted his head slightly, as though attuning himself to the night, waiting for the watcher to betray themselves. Then, from the shadows at the far end of the alley, a figure bolted. "Stop!" I shouted, but Holmes was already in motion. He sprang forward with astonishing speed, weaving past broken barrels and scattered refuse. The fleeing figure, tall, wrapped in a long, tattered coat, raced down the narrow passage, darting left into the labyrinth of Whitechapel's alleys. Holmes pursued without hesitation. "Watson, this way!" he called. I followed as best I could, my breath misting in the cold air. Ainsworth, however, hesitated, unwilling to venture further into the dark. The chase twisted through narrow streets, past shuttered shops and silent tenements. Our quarry was swift, but Holmes was relentless, his long strides eating up the distance between them. Suddenly, the figure veered sharply into an old courtyard, bounded by decaying brick walls. A moment later, Holmes and I entered after them, only to find the space empty. I skidded to a halt, scanning the darkness. Where did they go? Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he turned in a slow circle, studying the ground, the walls, the possible exits. "Interesting," he murmured. He bent down, his gloved fingers brushing the damp cobblestones. "Watson, take note. No footprints beyond this point." I frowned. "You mean they vanished?" Holmes exhaled through his nose. "Hardly. But their method of escape is unconventional." I followed his gaze upward, where the jagged rooftops loomed overhead. Could the figure have scaled the walls? It seemed impossible. Yet there were no other explanations. Holmes straightened, dusting off his hands. "It appears our elusive observer does not wish to be found tonight. A pity." He turned on his heel. "Come, Watson, let us return before Mr. Ainsworth convinces himself we have been taken by the phantom." As we retraced our steps, my mind raced with questions. Who had been watching us? A mere thief, hoping to avoid trouble, or something more sinister? Someone who knew exactly what we were investigating. Back at the crime scene, Ainsworth was pacing anxiously. Upon seeing us, he hurried forward. "Did you catch them?" Holmes brushed past him, deep in thought. "No, but they were close enough to hear everything we said, which means they already know we are here." Ainsworth paled. "And that means—" Holmes smiled faintly. "It means they will make another move soon enough, and when they do, we shall be ready." I felt a familiar chill, not from the night air, but from the certainty in Holmes's voice. He was not merely investigating a murder. He was drawing something or someone into the light, and whatever it was, it had just realized it was being hunted. A ghost among suspects. By the time we returned to Baker Street, the city had quieted, save for the occasional clatter of a passing carriage. Ainsworth had insisted on accompanying us, his nerves still raw from the night's events. He sat stiffly in the armchair opposite Holmes, his fingers gripping his knees as though they alone anchored him to reality. I busied myself preparing tea while Holmes settled into his customary position, leaning back in his chair, fingertips pressed together in contemplation. The firelight flickered against the sharp planes of his face, his expression unreadable. "Tell me, Mr. Ainsworth," he said at last, "you are a solicitor, accustomed to dealing with facts. Surely you do not believe in phantoms?" Ainsworth hesitated. "No," he admitted, "but what I saw—" He exhaled. "It was unnatural, Mr. Holmes. That figure in the alley, the way it moved. And now, this watcher in the dark. It is as if something unseen hounds our every step." Holmes tilted his head slightly. "Fear is a powerful illusionist, Mr. Ainsworth. It makes shadows dance and lends voices to the wind. But illusions do not leave corpses in their wake. Someone, flesh and blood, is behind this deception." I handed Ainsworth his tea, but his hands were unsteady as he took it. "Then who?" he asked. "Who would go to such lengths?" Holmes turned his gaze to the fire. "That is the question, is it not?" I cleared my throat. "We must consider who had reason to silence Thomas Gillis. He was investigating something that led him straight to his death. If we can determine the nature of his research, we will be closer to his murderer." Holmes nodded approvingly. "Precisely, Watson. And as luck would have it, we need not search far for that answer." Ainsworth looked up sharply. "You know," Holmes leaned forward, eyes glittering. "Not yet, but I intend to." With that, he retrieved a small envelope from his inner coat pocket. He turned it over between his fingers before placing it on the table. "A reporter's instinct is to document everything." Before we left Whitechapel, I took the liberty of searching Mr. Gillis's pockets. He tapped the envelope. Inside was a key, a hotel room key, to be precise, room 203 of the Grosvenor House on the Strand. I started. Then his notes, his research, may still be there untouched. Holmes finished. And if so, they will tell us what he discovered before his untimely demise. Ainsworth's face darkened. But what if someone else has already been there? Holmes gave him a sharp smile. "Then we shall see what they have left behind." He stood abruptly, reaching for his coat. "Watson, I believe we have an errand to run before dawn. Mr. Ainsworth, I suggest you remain here. Mrs. Hudson will ensure you are not spirited away by any apparitions in our absence." Ainsworth did not protest. He merely exhaled, rubbing his temples. "Be careful, Mr. Holmes." Holmes chuckled as he stepped toward the door. "My dear sir, I am always careful. It is the rest of London that should worry." And with that, we ventured once more into the fog-shrouded streets, drawn deeper into the mystery of the Phantom of Whitechapel. The journalist's secret. The streets of London were eerily silent as Holmes and I arrived at the Grosvenor House Hotel on the Strand. The grand building loomed above us, its facade dimly illuminated by gas lamps. The hour was late, and only a few hansom cabs lingered by the entrance, their drivers dozing beneath heavy cloaks. Holmes wasted no time. Striding past the drowsy night porter with an air of quiet authority, he ascended the staircase to the second floor. I followed, heart pounding, the weight of the mystery pressing upon us. At room 203, Holmes produced the key he had taken from Thomas Gillis's pocket. With a precise motion, he turned the lock, and the door creaked open. The room was small and sparsely furnished. A desk, a narrow bed, and a single window overlooking the street below. The air was thick with dust and stale tobacco smoke. The bed was unmade, and atop the desk sat a stack of notes, hastily scribbled, as if their owner had been in a great rush. Holmes closed the door behind us and lit the oil lamp. The flickering glow cast long shadows across the walls. "Watson," he murmured, "it seems our dear Mr. Gillis was quite the meticulous investigator." I stepped forward, scanning the notes on the desk. Pages upon pages were covered in frantic handwriting, circling names and locations. Whitechapel, Mayfair, Blackwood, and I inhaled sharply. "Holmes, look at this." He turned as I pointed to a single phrase, scrawled repeatedly across one of the pages. "The phantom walks where the gaslight fades." Holmes studied the words, tapping a thoughtful finger against his chin. A poetic turn of phrase, but what does it mean? I flipped through more pages, scanning the notes. Gillis must have been onto something substantial. He mentions a series of unexplained murders, bodies found in darkened alleyways where the street lamps had been broken or extinguished. Holmes's eyes gleamed. A pattern. Deliberate manipulation of darkness to conceal the crime. Our so-called phantom does not merely haunt Whitechapel. He chooses his stage carefully. Before I could respond, Holmes straightened abruptly, his keen gaze snapping toward the window. "What is it?" I asked. He held up a hand for silence. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "We are not alone." My breath caught. Slowly I turned, following his gaze. The window, though closed, bore a faint smudge against the glass, as if someone had pressed their face against it moments ago. I strode to the window and flung it open, but the street below was empty. Whoever had been watching us had already vanished into the night. Holmes exhaled, his lips curling into a knowing smile. "It appears we are not the only ones interested in Mr. Gillis's secrets." I felt a chill creep along my spine. "Do you think they saw what we found?" Holmes picked up the journalist's notes and folded them neatly into his coat. "Perhaps. But the real question, Watson, is whether they intend to stop us from seeing more." With that ominous thought hanging between us, we left the dimly lit room, stepping once more into the uncertainty of the London night, a whisper in the fog. The journey back to Baker Street was marked by an uneasy silence. The streets of London, though empty, seemed to breathe with unseen life, as if the city itself were watching. Holmes sat deep in thought, his long fingers tapping idly against the folded notes in his coat pocket. As our cab rattled through the gaslit avenues, I could not shake the feeling that we were being followed. More than once, I caught glimpses of movement in the shadows, figures slipping into alleys, lingering at street corners only to disappear when I turned my head. Holmes noticed my unease. "Your instincts serve you well, Watson," he murmured. "We are indeed being observed." I stiffened. "By whom?" He exhaled thoughtfully. "That remains to be seen, but I suspect our mysterious phantom is growing restless." We arrived at Baker Street without incident, though the sensation of being watched never left me. As Holmes unlocked the door, I cast a final glance over my shoulder. The street was empty, and yet I knew someone was out there. Inside, Ainsworth was pacing the sitting room like a man awaiting a verdict. At the sight of us, he rushed forward. "Did you find anything?" he asked, his voice hoarse with anxiety. Holmes removed his coat with measured patience before responding. "Indeed, Mr. Gillis was investigating a pattern, murders committed in areas where the street lamps had been extinguished. Our so-called phantom does not haunt at random. He operates in darkness, by design." Ainsworth paled. "You mean he controls the light?" Holmes sank into his chair, steepling his fingers. "Perhaps not the light itself, but the absence of it. Someone ensures these areas remain dark, unseen, and in those pockets of blackness, men disappear, never to be heard from again." Ainsworth swallowed hard. "Then we are dealing with something more than just a legend." Holmes tilted his head. "A legend serves a purpose. Fear is a most effective tool, Mr. Ainsworth. It blinds men as surely as the night." At that moment, a sharp rap echoed at the door. We froze. The knock was measured, deliberate, not the hurried pounding of a messenger nor the hesitant tap of an unexpected guest. It was a summons. Holmes stood swiftly, crossing the room in 2 strides. He motioned for silence, then opened the door a fraction. A figure stood on the doorstep, barely visible in the gaslight. Cloaked in a long coat, with the brim of a hat casting shadows over his face, he remained still as though carved from the night itself. Holmes regarded him coolly. "You have come a long way to find us, I presume." The figure hesitated, then spoke in a low voice. "I know what you seek, Mr. Holmes, but if you value your life, you will abandon this case at once." The words sent a chill through me. Holmes, however, merely smiled. "My dear sir," he said softly, "you have just ensured that I will do the exact opposite." The man exhaled sharply, as if disappointed by the answer. "Then I fear the phantom will come for you next." And with that, he turned and vanished into the fog. Holmes closed the door and turned to us, his expression unreadable. "Well, Watson," he murmured, "it seems we have made an impression." Ainsworth looked as though he might faint. You're not going to listen to him, are you?" Holmes chuckled. "On the contrary, Mr. Ainsworth. I intend to listen most carefully. After all, warnings often reveal more than threats." He sat back down, his fingers tapping against the notes in his lap. "Now, let us find out who fears the light, and why they would rather we remain in the dark." The man who vanished. The warning had unsettled Ainsworth, but Holmes appeared invigorated by it. He thrived in the presence of intrigue, and the cryptic message had only sharpened his resolve. As dawn broke over London, Holmes sat hunched over Gillis's notes, his keen eyes scanning the chaotic script with calculated precision. The phrase, "the phantom walks where the gaslight fades," had particularly captured his interest. "Watson," he murmured, tapping the page, "do you recall the case of the missing lamplighter in Whitechapel 2 months ago?" I frowned, reaching into my memory. Yes, a man named Edwin Fowler. He disappeared while on his rounds, leaving his cart behind. The police assumed robbery, but his body was never found. "Precisely," Holmes said, his fingers drumming against the table. "Fowler was responsible for maintaining the street lamps in the very areas where Gillis noted the murders occurring in darkness." Ainsworth sat forward. "You mean to say the Phantom, whoever he is, has been deliberately ensuring these streets remain unlit?" Holmes nodded. "And when Fowler vanished, the darkness became complete." A strange chill ran through me. Then Fowler was not merely a victim, he was an obstacle. Holmes smiled faintly. "You see it now, Watson. Someone needed those lamps to remain extinguished." And Gillis, ever the determined journalist, began asking why. Ainsworth's voice wavered. "But who would go to such lengths? Who benefits from these murders?" Holmes did not answer immediately. He picked up Gillis's notes again, flipping through them until he landed on a page filled with circled names. "Fowler's disappearance is key, but so too are the victims." He pointed at the notes. "Each man who fell to the Phantom was in some way tied to the East End. Dock workers, merchants, even an inspector. What do they have in common?" I studied the names carefully. Many were unfamiliar, but a few sparked recognition. "Some of these men were connected to a smuggling case last year," I said. "I recall reading about a raid at the docks. A criminal ring bringing goods into London under false shipping manifests." Holmes snapped his fingers. "Yes, Watson, and what better way to operate in secrecy than to control the very light that exposes your dealings?" The realization hit me like a jolt. "You mean to say these murders are not the work of some supernatural killer, but a calculated effort to eliminate threats to an illicit enterprise?" "Exactly," Holmes said. And Gillis, ever the relentless investigator, had begun uncovering the truth. That is why he was silenced. Ainsworth paled. "Then we are dealing with something far worse than a mere murderer." Holmes leaned back in his chair, his eyes alight with deduction. "Indeed, Mr. Ainsworth, we are dealing with men who kill not for sport, nor for passion, but for profit." A knock at the door interrupted us, sharp and urgent. Before I could react, Mrs. Hudson appeared, wringing her hands. "A gentleman to see you, Mr. Holmes. He says it's urgent." Holmes rose, casting me a glance. "Show him in." A moment later, a man stumbled into the room. He was gaunt, his eyes darting wildly, as though pursued by unseen horrors. His clothes were soaked, his hands trembling. "Mr. Holmes," he gasped, They tried to kill me." Holmes stepped forward, steadying the man by the shoulders. "Calm yourself, sir. Who are you?" The man swallowed hard. "Edwin Fowler, the lamplighter. I know who the Phantom is." Ainsworth sucked in a breath. I stared in shock. Holmes only smiled. "Well now," he murmured, "this is most unexpected." The lamplighter's tale, Edwin Fowler, collapsed into the chair Holmes had offered him, his breath coming in shallow, frantic gasps. His clothes were soaked through, and his face bore the unmistakable marks of someone who had spent hours in the dark, running through the London streets. The haunted look in his eyes, however, was far more telling than his dishevelled appearance. Holmes wasted no time. "Mr. Fowler, you are quite fortunate to be alive. Now tell us what happened." Fowler looked up, his eyes wide with terror. He stopped, swallowing hard. "I saw them. I didn't believe it at first, but it's true. The Phantom's no ghost, Mr. Holmes. He's a man who controls the night." Holmes leaned forward, his hand steepled beneath his chin. "You've seen him, then?" Fowler nodded, his hands trembling as he wiped his brow. "I've been in this business for 10 years, Mr. Holmes, lighting the lamps, keeping the streets safe. But last week something changed. The lights started going out, one by one. Every evening, like clockwork, they'd flicker and die, leaving the streets dark and empty. And then the killings started." I exchanged a glance with Holmes. "The same areas?" "Yes," Fowler whispered, his voice barely audible. "Whitechapel, the docks, near the river. The shadows swallowed everything. People disappeared, men who'd never hurt a soul. And then I saw him." "Who?" Holmes pressed. Fowler recoiled, as though the very memory burned. "A figure, standing beneath the lampposts, watching me. I thought it was a trick of the light at first, but he kept appearing, night after night, always when the lights went out. A tall man, cloaked in black. His face, I couldn't see it, not clearly, but I knew he was there. I could feel him in the dark, waiting." "Did you recognize him?" I asked. Fowler shook his head violently. "No, but he knew me. I swear, he knew my every move. I tried to stop him, tried to light the lamps again, but he would always appear, and then the lights would flicker out as though he were controlling them. One evening I confronted him. I had to know who he was." Holmes's gaze never wavered. "And?" Fowler paused, as though gathering the strength to continue. He laughed, just a low, cold laugh. And then he said, "You are not meant to see the truth, Fowler. The dark is my domain now." And with that, he was gone, into the shadows. I leaned forward. "And you fled?" "Yes," Fowler admitted. "I knew then that I had seen too much. I came here hoping you could help, but they found me. Last night they tried to kill me, 2 men dressed in black. They came after me just as I was about to reach a safer part of the city. They had knives. They nearly—" He broke off, his voice cracking. Holmes's expression was unreadable, but I could see the gears turning in his mind. "So, you fled to us, not just for protection, but to reveal what you had learned." Fowler nodded miserably. "I didn't want to die in the dark, Mr. Holmes. I thought, if anyone could stop this, it would be you." Holmes rose slowly, walking to the window. The fog outside had thickened, wrapping the city in an oppressive embrace. "It seems our phantom is no mere myth." And Mr. Gillis, with his unyielding curiosity, paid the price for uncovering too much. Fowler's gaze darted nervously toward the door. "What now, Mr. Holmes? What are you going to do?" Holmes turned, his eyes gleaming with that sharp intensity I knew all too well. "We are going to expose the man behind the mask, Mr. Fowler, and we are going to do so before the darkness swallows anyone else." Fowler's face twisted with a mixture of hope and fear. "How? How will we find him?" Holmes's lips curled into a slight smile. "We have a lead, my good man. The man who warned us at Baker Street did not come to simply threaten. He came to set a trap, and I intend to spring it with you, Mr. Fowler, as our unwitting bait." Fowler looked horrified. "Bait? You mean me?" Holmes's gaze softened slightly. "You are the key to finding him, Mr. Fowler. You have seen the Phantom, and I have no doubt that he will come for you again." A tense silence filled the room. I could feel the weight of the plan settling around us, its danger and its promise. But one thing was certain. We had crossed a threshold. The next steps would lead us deeper into the heart of the mystery, and there would be no turning back. Holmes turned to Ainsworth. "We need to prepare, Ainsworth. Gather whatever resources we can. This man, whoever he is, will not stop until he silences those who threaten his empire of darkness." Ainsworth nodded, his face pale but resolute. "I'll do whatever it takes, Mr. Holmes." "Good," Holmes replied, his voice calm, yet filled with an unsettling certainty. "Let the game begin. The trap is set." The hours that followed were a flurry of activity. Holmes, as always, had a clear plan in mind, precise and meticulous in every detail. Ainsworth had swiftly departed to procure the necessary arrangements, while Holmes set to work preparing the scene for what he anticipated would be a confrontation with the Phantom. I could see that Holmes was operating with an unsettling calm, his every movement deliberate. There was no sign of the usual tension that accompanied his most complicated cases, as if he were already a step ahead of whatever dangers lay ahead. It was an unsettling kind of confidence, one that, in past cases, had either been a harbinger of success or disaster. "Watson," Holmes said without looking up from his notes, "I need you to accompany Mr. Fowler tonight. We cannot afford to be caught unawares." I nodded, understanding the gravity of his words. Holmes had been preparing for this moment for hours, setting his plan into motion. "And you?" I asked, though I already suspected the answer. "I shall be in the shadows, watching. I need to ensure that everything proceeds as it should." The plan was straightforward. Fowler, as the key witness, would serve as the bait. His return to the streets of Whitechapel, under the guise of resuming his duties as a lamplighter, would lure the Phantom into a trap. He would be accompanied by myself, but Holmes would remain hidden, his sharp eyes watching for any signs of movement. We had arranged for several plainclothes officers to blend into the crowds, ensuring that the streets would be monitored from every angle. But it was Holmes's keen sense of observation that we all relied on, his ability to see through the veneer of deception that so often clouded the truth. Fowler, for his part, was visibly nervous, though he had agreed to the plan with the same mixture of fear and determination that had marked his earlier words. He had no other choice but to trust us. "It is imperative that you remain calm, Mr. Fowler," Holmes instructed him. "The Phantom will only act when he feels certain of his advantage. If you reveal any fear or hesitation, it may send him into hiding." Fowler nodded, though I could see the unease still clouding his face. "I understand, but how can we be sure he'll come?" Holmes leaned forward, his eyes sharp. "We know he is watching you, and we know that he will not let an opportunity like this pass him by." The clock struck the hour, and we made our way to Whitechapel, the thick fog wrapping the city in a cold embrace. The streets seemed eerily silent, the usual bustle of activity muted by the oppressive mist. As we approached the designated location, the very same spot where Fowler had last seen the phantom, a strange tension gripped the air. The gaslights flickered and died one by one, as if on cue. I glanced at Holmes, who gave a brief nod, confirming that everything was proceeding according to plan. Fowler stood at the centre of the street, his hands trembling slightly as he began to light the first of the lamps. His movements were slow, deliberate, though I could tell he was forcing himself to maintain composure. And then a sound, barely audible above the whisper of the wind, reached my ears. The distinct creak of boots on damp cobblestone. I stiffened, my hand instinctively moving toward the revolver at my side. "Holmes," I whispered. "He's here." Holmes was already in motion, his eyes scanning the shadows with practiced precision. He stepped silently into the darkness, vanishing from view as I remained by Fowler's side. I could hear the man's breath coming in shallow gasps, the fear once again creeping into his voice. "Do you see him?" Fowler hissed, his eyes darting about in panic. I shook my head, though I too felt the weight of the presence lurking in, the shadows. It was as if the very darkness had taken on a life of its own, breathing around us, watching us. And then there, just beyond the flickering glow of the gaslight, there was a figure, tall, cloaked in black, his face hidden in shadow. He stepped forward with quiet, deliberate movements, his presence like a cloud that swallowed the light around him. The phantom. I did not hesitate. With a quick motion, I signalled to Holmes, who had positioned himself just out of sight. The officers, hidden in the crowd, began to close in, ensuring that our trap was set. But before I could take another step, the figure spoke, his voice low and chilling. "You think you can stop me, Sherlock Holmes?" It was not a question, but a statement, one that sent a shiver down my spine. I turned, glancing toward Holmes, whose form had materialized from the shadows with a suddenness that took even me by surprise. "You are mistaken, Phantom," Holmes said, his voice calm, almost amused. "You are already caught." The figure hesitated, and in that fleeting moment I saw something in his eyes, a flash of uncertainty, perhaps even fear. But it was gone in an instant, replaced by a sneer. "You've played your hand too early," the phantom growled. "This is not the end, Holmes. It is only the beginning." Holmes took a step forward, his gaze never leaving the phantom. "I believe we shall see about that." And then the night erupted into chaos. The unmasking, the moment the phantom spoke. Those chilling words, the atmosphere seemed to shift. What had once been a quiet, calculated trap exploded into chaos. The figure before us, a shadow cloaked in mystery, shifted, his movements quick and deliberate. He knew we were closing in, but what I had not expected was the sudden shift in his demeanour. The air grew heavier, filled with an intensity that seemed almost suffocating. I instinctively reached for my revolver, but Holmes, his eyes sharp and unwavering, motioned for me to stay calm. He knew, he always knew, how to handle such moments with an eerie calmness that defied the chaos around us. The phantom's voice, though calm, was laced with an unmistakable undercurrent of malice. "You think this is over, Holmes?" The words slid from his lips like venom, his tone dark and low. "You think you've trapped me? You haven't the faintest idea of the forces at play here." Holmes did not flinch. Instead, he stepped forward, a small, almost imperceptible smile playing at the corner of his lips. "I know far more than you think, Phantom, and now we will see the truth." The figure before us tensed, his hand twitching towards the folds of his cloak, but before he could make any further move, a low voice echoed from the shadows behind us. "It's time to stop hiding behind that mask." I turned quickly, my heart racing, to see Inspector Lestrade step from the cover of the alleyway, flanked by several uniformed officers. They had managed to position themselves in just the right places, closing off every possible escape route. The Phantom's eyes flickered for the briefest of moments. An expression of recognition, or perhaps panic, but it was enough. In that fleeting second, Holmes seized his chance. "Now, Watson!" Holmes commanded. Before I could react, Holmes was already on the move, darting forward with the grace and precision of a man who had already anticipated every move. He reached out, his fingers gripping the Phantom's cloak, pulling it back with a sharp motion. The man, tall, dark, and imposing, stood frozen for a moment, as if the truth of his unmasking had momentarily stunned him. Then the figure's face was revealed in full. It was a face I did not expect, a face familiar, though worn and hardened by years of hidden schemes. Fowler gasped, "No, it can't be him!" But it was. The Phantom was none other than Richard Caldwell, the wealthy and well-respected philanthropist, a man known for his charitable work across London, a man who, until now, had been above suspicion. Holmes stood motionless, his gaze locked on Caldwell. "I had suspected as much. Your calculated movements, your knowledge of the shadows, the way you controlled the dark. It all pointed to someone who had access to the city's secrets. And you, Mr. Caldwell, were the one orchestrating the fear that gripped Whitechapel." Caldwell's eyes burned with fury, but he did not resist as the officers closed in, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender. "You know nothing of the power I wield," he snarled. "The streets, the people, I gave them everything. But they betrayed me. They didn't understand, didn't appreciate the order I brought to their chaos. So I took it back. I controlled the shadows, the fear. I became the Phantom." Fowler, who had been standing rigid with shock, finally spoke, his voice trembling with disbelief. "But why? Why kill those men? Why make them disappear?" Caldwell's lips twisted into a bitter smile. "They were nothing more than pawns in my game. Those men, those lives, were mere sacrifices to fuel the power I sought. But it's over now. I see that." Holmes stepped forward, his expression inscrutable. "It was always going to be over, Mr. Caldwell. The darkness you tried to control can only last for so long before the light reveals it for what it truly is." Lestrade, who had been watching the scene unfold, now stepped in, signalling for the officers to secure Caldwell. The entire charade had crumbled. Caldwell, the so-called Phantom, was now nothing more than a man caught in the web of his own deception. "I'm taking him in, Holmes," Lestrade said, his voice steady, but tinged with the familiar exasperation that always followed Holmes's revelations. "But I must say, your methods always astound me." Holmes merely nodded, his gaze never leaving Caldwell. "The case is not entirely resolved, Lestrade. There is still much we do not understand. Caldwell's eyes narrowed. What more is there to know, Holmes? I've been caught. There's nothing more to say. Holmes, for the first time in our dealings with him, smiled a little. There is always more to know, Mr. Caldwell. The full scope of your machinations. How deep does it go? You couldn't have orchestrated this on your own. I could see Caldwell's defiance falter at the question. You think there are others? He hissed. I am certain of it, Holmes replied, his eyes gleaming with that characteristic sharpness. You had help, Mr. Caldwell, and we will find out who. As the officers led Caldwell away, Holmes turned to Fowler. You were brave, Mr. Fowler. You will be safe now. Fowler nodded, still in shock from the events that had unfolded so quickly. Thank you, Mr. Holmes. I never thought it would be him. Holmes gave a small, almost imperceptible shrug. The truth is often the last thing we expect. But now we can move forward. The Phantom is unmasked, but the game is far from over. I glanced at Holmes, wondering what lay ahead. Even with Caldwell's capture, I knew that there were still pieces of the puzzle missing. But for now, the city could breathe a little easier, knowing that the shadows no longer had their master. The final revelation. The case had drawn to a apparent close. And yet, the sense of unease that had gripped me since the very first moment we set foot in Whitechapel did not dissipate. Even as Lestrade and his officers escorted Richard Caldwell, the so-called Phantom, to his awaiting carriage, I found myself troubled by something Holmes had said moments before we concluded our encounter. There is always more to know, Watson. Holmes had told me, his voice quieter now, his eyes still locked on Caldwell. The full scope of your machinations. How deep does it go? It had been said so matter-of-factly, but I could sense there was something behind the words. A deeper level to the puzzle that had not yet been revealed. And though the man responsible for the terror in Whitechapel had been captured, a nagging feeling of uncertainty clung to my thoughts. Holmes, as always, seemed unaffected by such things. He turned away from the scene, his face once again a mask of indifference, and made his way toward the nearby tavern where we had arranged to meet with Lestrade. I followed in his wake, though my mind continued to whirl with questions. I think the matter is concluded, Holmes, I said, falling into step beside him. Caldwell has confessed, admitted to his role in orchestrating the fear that has plagued the city for so long. Holmes gave a small, thoughtful hum, but did not respond immediately. As we entered the tavern, Lestrade greeted us, his face lined with both exhaustion and satisfaction. He motioned to the table where several papers lay scattered, evidence from the investigation. You were right, Holmes, Lestrade said, taking a seat. Caldwell confessed to everything. The killings, the disappearances, the fear he manipulated. The man was nothing more than a puppet master, playing with the lives of the poor souls in Whitechapel. But Lestrade hesitated, looking between Holmes and me, as though weighing his words. There's something else, something we don't understand. Holmes nodded, his gaze fixed on Lestrade. Go on. Lestrade shifted uneasily. When we searched Caldwell's estate, we found several documents, plans, blueprints, nothing that directly tied him to the murders. But there's one thing we couldn't ignore. A list of names. At this, Holmes raised an eyebrow. Names? Yes, Lestrade continued, his voice lowering. They were all men and women from high society, influential figures, individuals who have not only been untouched by the law, but also have been strangely absent from public view in recent months. There's no direct connection between them and the crimes, but the list is troubling. Holmes remained silent for a long moment, his fingers steepling in front of him as he processed the new information. The atmosphere in the room seemed to grow heavier, as if we had crossed into dangerous territory. Territory where the truth was no longer as simple as a man in the shadows committing unspeakable acts. "You believe Caldwell had help?" Holmes said, his voice low, almost a whisper. Lestrade nodded. "That's what we think, but we can't prove it yet. The documents don't give us enough, and none of the names appear to have any obvious ties to Caldwell." Holmes's expression darkened, his mind already working through the possibilities. "This isn't the work of one man, Lestrade. Caldwell was the figurehead, the puppet master, but there are others pulling the strings. The timing of the murders, the way the terror was orchestrated, the very nature of the phantom's appearances. It all leads me to believe that we're dealing with something far larger than we initially thought." Lestrade shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "But who? Who else could be behind this?" Holmes stood suddenly, his eyes gleaming with the kind of focused intensity I had come to recognize in the midst of his most groundbreaking revelations. "That is the question, my dear Lestrade, and it is a question we will answer in time." He turned to face me. "Watson, we've only just begun to scratch the surface. The Phantom was not a single man in the shadows, but a mask, a symbol used to manipulate, a much more dangerous game." Before I could respond, Holmes continued, his voice now quieter, his words measured. "The list of names, the high society figures, they are part of something much darker. Caldwell was the catalyst, but the true architects of this terror are still out there, hiding in plain sight." I felt a shiver crawl down my spine. The room seemed to close in around me, as the full gravity of what Holmes had just said settled into my bones. We had thought the case was over, that justice had been served, but in truth, it had only just begun. Holmes took a few steps toward the window, his gaze fixed on the fog that hung over the London streets. His eyes narrowed as he stared into the mist, lost in thought. "This is only the beginning, Watson. The Phantom was just a prelude." Lestrade stood as well, his face now serious. "So, what do we do now?" Holmes turned to face him, a faint smile crossing his lips. "We wait, Lestrade. The truth will reveal itself when we least expect it." With that, Holmes turned and left the tavern, his figure vanishing into the night, swallowed by the fog. I followed close behind, knowing in my heart that our work was far from finished. The case of the Phantom of Whitechapel had been solved, but the deeper mystery of the forces at play, those pulling the strings behind the scenes, remained. As we walked back into the shadows, I couldn't help but wonder what lay ahead. What darker truths were hidden beneath the surface of this city, waiting to be uncovered? And who, I thought, would be the next to fall into the web of the Phantom's influence? The final deception. As Holmes and I walked back through the fog-choked streets of London, I felt the weight of the case pressing down on me more heavily than ever before. The days of uncertainty had stretched longer than I anticipated, And the deeper Holmes delved into the enigma of the Phantom, the more I realized that his mind, sharp as it was, could not see everything. In fact, his silences, those long moments of reflection in which I could hear nothing but the rhythmic tap of our footsteps, spoke volumes. It wasn't until several days later, after Lestrade had come and gone with his reports, that I finally understood the full scope of Holmes's thoughts. It was a dreary Tuesday morning when we received word that another figure had been found dead. Another victim, another apparent casualty of a night of terror. It was far too easy to dismiss this new crime as one more in a string of grisly killings. Indeed, it would have been simple to attribute it to the chaotic aftermath of Caldwell's arrest. But I had learned long ago that nothing Holmes encountered was ever as straightforward as it seemed. We arrived at the scene quickly. A lavish townhouse tucked away in one of the quieter corners of London. The crime scene was immaculate, a stark contrast to the grim chaos of Whitechapel. The victim, a prominent socialite named Edward Fairfax, lay in a chair, an elegant weapon, a rare silver letter opener, protruding from his chest. His face was calm, almost serene in death, as though he had been expecting the blow. Holmes surveyed the room with his customary precision. "Notice, Watson, the lack of struggle," he murmured, running a finger across the polished surface of the nearby table. This was not an ordinary assassination. I watched him closely, sensing a shift in his demeanour. There was an odd tension in his posture, a quiet sense of urgency. "This is no random act," he continued, his gaze flicking towards the open window. "The Phantom's reach is far wider than we first suspected." Lestrade entered the room shortly after, his face a study of confusion. "Holmes, this doesn't make sense. Fairfax was an ally of Caldwell, a friend of the Phantom's. Why would anyone murder him now?" Holmes gave Lestrade a sharp, knowing look. "Precisely the question, my dear Lestrade. If Fairfax were merely a bystander, this would have been another in a series of meaningless deaths. But this is far more deliberate than that." He paused, inspecting the room with renewed intensity. "You see, Fairfax was more than just a man connected to Caldwell. He was the key. He was the one holding the strings." I stepped forward, trying to catch up with Holmes's train of thought. "What do you mean? You said Caldwell was the figurehead. Surely the arrest of Caldwell should have ended this. Why now?" Holmes turned to face me, his eyes glimmering with that familiar spark of insight. "Watson, you were right in thinking that we had solved the case with Caldwell. But you see, the Phantom was never one man. It was never just Caldwell. He was merely the agent, the face of a greater network, a network of wealthy and influential individuals. And Fairfax was one of them." I stood silent for a moment, allowing Holmes's words to settle in. The pieces were falling into place in a way that was both shocking and unsettling. Holmes began to pace, his mind clearly working at full capacity. Caldwell's death, though we believed it to be the final act in the Phantom's reign, was only the beginning. Fairfax's murder, a well-timed strike, is a message. And the message is that the true architect of this terror is still at large. Lestrade's eyes widened in realization. "So someone else is still pulling the strings?" "Exactly," Holmes said, stopping mid-step to face the officer. "Caldwell may have been a puppet master, but he was not the only one. Fairfax had been playing his own game, a different one, behind closed doors. He too was a part of the web, a member of the clandestine group that orchestrated these horrors. But now that he's gone, the balance has shifted. Someone else is taking his place. It was then that I saw it, the final piece of the puzzle, hidden in plain sight. There, under the chair where Fairfax had fallen, was a simple card, a small unmarked slip of paper. Holmes bent down to pick it up with delicate fingers, his gaze never leaving the paper, as he studied it intently. It was a symbol, simple but unmistakable, a stylized raven, its wings spread wide, perched atop a twisted spiral. It meant nothing to me at first glance, but to Holmes it was a key to a much darker door. "Do you see it, Watson?" Holmes asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "This symbol, it's a signature, a brand of sorts. It belongs to an underground society, one far older than I had anticipated. They have been working in the shadows for years, manipulating the lives of London's elite for their own gain. And Fairfax, he was one of their leaders." I felt a chill ripple down my spine. The full scale of the conspiracy was only now coming into focus. We were not dealing with a single criminal, or even a small group of criminals. This was a hidden network, a secret society with tentacles reaching into the highest echelons of power. The Phantom was but a guise, a tool to strike fear and control. Holmes turned to face Lestrade once more, his expression grim. "The case is far from over, my friend. Fairfax's death, Caldwell's confession, these are but pieces in a much larger puzzle, and we must now uncover the rest of it before it's too late." As we stepped out of the townhouse, the fog had thickened, wrapping the city in a suffocating blanket. I glanced up at Holmes, his figure cutting through the mist like a solitary beacon of clarity. He seemed distant, lost in thought, his mind already racing ahead, calculating the next move. "Holmes," I asked, my voice steady despite the unease settling over me, "what happens now?" Holmes stopped, turning to face me one final time. His eyes gleamed with an intensity that could not be ignored. "Now, Watson, we begin the hunt. The Phantom's final mask has yet to fall, but we will reveal it, and when we do, the full depth of this conspiracy will come to light." As Holmes turned and began to walk into the darkness, I couldn't shake the feeling that, even now, we were still at the edge of something much larger, something more dangerous than we could fully comprehend. The streets of London would never be the same again, and neither would we.